Historical memory often limits the events of 1857 to a spontaneous military mutiny triggered entirely by greased Enfield rifle cartridges. The cartridge acted as the immediate trigger, but the underlying volatility came from a century of East India Company policy. Starting with the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company launched an aggressive campaign of territorial expansion. Over the next 100 years, they systematically dismantled native sovereignty across the subcontinent. To understand why the system collapsed in 1857, we must examine the specific stressors applied to native society. These policy failures occupy four intersecting sectors: political, economic, social, and military. Viewed as a whole, the 1857 revolt appears as the predictable outcome of a colonial system that had simultaneously pushed every tier of Indian society to a breaking point. In the political quadrant, Governor-General Lord Dalhousie accelerated the annexation of native states. He used the doctrine of lapse to seize territories without natural heirs, took the Punjab by force, and in 1856 annexed the state of Awadh by claiming its government was incompetent. The annexation of Awadh carried an immediate consequence for the labor market. Disbanding Awadh's 60,000-man native army forced those soldiers into an agrarian system already struggling under high taxes. Coinciding with a strike against native aristocracy, the 1852 Inam Commission confiscated 20,000 estates from landowners lacking strict, Western-style written titles. In the marketplace, British policy favored the metropole at the expense of local industry. By maintaining high duties on Indian textiles while flooding the colony with cheap, machine-made goods from Britain, the company effectively dismantled the local economy. These weavers worked a traditional industry that had flourished for centuries. British industrial imports made their labor economically unviable, leaving millions of skilled artisans destitute. Stripping the wealth of artisans and traditional landowners, the company created a massive population of disenfranchised citizens with no stake in the colonial order. On the social vector, the company introduced laws that challenged traditional religious life. While the 1829 ban on sati and the 1856 Widow Remarriage Act were intended as reforms, many within the community saw them as an invasive attempt to rewrite their social code from the top down. Suspicions grew with the Religious Disabilities Act of 1856. By ensuring that Christian converts could still inherit ancestral property, the law signaled to many that the company was providing a structural incentive for mass conversion. Even new technology became a source of social friction. The railway network established in 1854 forced different castes into the same carriages, which many perceived as a deliberate attempt to erode traditional social boundaries. To the native population, these were not merely administrative changes. They were interpreted as a coordinated campaign against their religious and cultural existence. These civilian pressures focused heavily on the military. Because the sepoy was essentially a peasant in uniform, the economic and social distress felt in the villages translated directly into the barracks. Professional grievances only added to the tension. Native soldiers were paid significantly less than their European counterparts and faced a racial ceiling that prevented them from rising above the rank of subadar. Legislative changes further eroded their status. The Post Office Act of 1854 ended the soldiers' right to send free mail, while the General Service Enlistment Act of 1856 required recruits to serve overseas, an act that would cause many to lose their caste standing. The Enfield rifle cartridge provided the spark for this saturated environment. The rumor that cartridges were greased with animal fat was the final break in the relationship between the company and its protectors. The East India Company had built its empire on the bayonets of the sepoys, yet its own policies had systematically dismantled the soldiers' incentive to remain loyal. In early 1857, mutinies broke out in Berhampur and Barrackpur. By May 10th, the movement reached a mass scale in Meerut as soldiers liberated their comrades and turned their weapons against the company. The Meerut rebels marched straight to Delhi. They sought political legitimacy by declaring the aging Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as the symbolic head of their movement. From Delhi, the rebellion expanded into a brutal regional war. This photograph of the ruined residency in Lucknow shows the physical impact of the urban combat that also leveled cities like Kanpur and Jhansi, as local leaders like Nana Sahib and Rani Lakshmibai led the resistance. Despite its scale, the uprising struggled against British logistics. The company used its telegraph lines to coordinate reinforcements, while the rebel groups remained largely isolated from one another. The rebellion also lacked a unified political objective. Without a shared vision for a post-colonial state, most leaders fought a defensive war to reclaim specific local lands or feudal titles. Furthermore, the British received critical support from territories that remained loyal. Rulers like the Scindias of Gwalior and various Sikh chiefs provided the men and resources necessary to sustain the British counteroffensive. The movement did not fail for lack of soldiers or bravery. It faltered because it could not achieve the logistical or ideological unity required to defeat a centralized industrial power. By the end of 1859, the British had re-established control. The prominent rebel leaders were either dead or in exile, and the uprising was officially over. The event's complexity is reflected in how it is named. British officials labeled it a sepoy mutiny to minimize its scope. Later, nationalist writers like V.D. Savarkar described it as the First War of Indian Independence. The scale of civilian involvement and the political coordination between rival groups, such as the Hindu Nana Sahib declaring loyalty to the Muslim Mughal emperor, suggests a degree of collective purpose that distinguishes the conflict from a typical military riot. The conflict forced an immediate end to the East India Company's rule. The British Crown took direct control of the government, and the Mughal dynasty, which had reigned since the 1500s, was formally abolished. The events of 1857 marked the final collapse of India's old feudal order. Observing the danger of a unified native resistance, the Crown moved to isolate different communities from one another. This tactical shift toward institutionalized divide and rule would dominate British administration for the remainder